Well, welcome everyone. Does anyone have a contract issue or other situation they want to discuss to kick this off? Or I'll go into my list, but yeah, if you got something, let me know. Okay, hearing nothing, we'll go to Gary's list. So we have I hate to bring up cancellation forms, but they probably about 10% or less of our transactions cancel for one way reason or another. A few number of listings cancel, probably just 1 or 2% of our listings cancel from time to time. But in our buyer transactions, I would say 5 to 10% maybe, depending. So we're looking at, we were representing a buyer, and our agent asked, the buyer went through their inspections, and they decided they didn't want to buy the property. So the agent was filling out the cancellation form, and we've gone over this in the past, but there's 3 things that are happening here. There's the cancellation of the contract, the RPA. There's a disposition of the deposit. That's instruction to the escrow holder, and a cancellation of the escrow. So this form deals with 3 things. And our agent was asking under this number 1 that the buyer was canceling, and they were canceling as permitted by the good faith exercise of paragraph 14. That's the inspection paragraph. And they were wondering if they had to put in more details there. What exactly was it that they didn't like about the property, or this or that? And the short answer is no. Do they have to attach any reports? If the seller asks for the reports, the seller is entitled to any reports that the buyer got. But if the seller doesn't ask, then there's no obligation to send them over. But yeah, they just have to put in the paragraph in the RPA under which they're canceling, and they have the right to cancel in good faith. Remember that good faith clause. And that's it. And then they would sign, date it, and then you move on to part 2, which is the disposition of the deposit and cancellation of escrow. So you reference the escrow number, number here, and whoever it is, let's say it's Fatco, and then the buyer, you release the buyer's deposit, which might be $10,000 or something. Well, let's call it $100,000. Good deposit. And the buyer authorizes release of $100,000 for buyer's deposit to seller. No, you don't want that one. Okay, sorry, take that back. Seller authorizes the release of buyer's deposit to the buyer. So that's doesn't state the amount. Actually, it's whatever is in the escrow at the time. So that takes care of the cancellation form pretty much. It does require mutual signatures. The buyer and the seller both have to sign. If the buyer signs and the seller doesn't, then there can be ramifications around that. And you should advise us right away if that's occurring. Okay. Any questions or comments on that? Hello, Steve. You signed on since I started. Good to see you. How's your septic issue coming along?
I have to unmute myself.
Yes.
The buyer's insurance company for the homeowner said they would not insure the property because the septic was not up to current codes. So the
Okay.
buyer canceled the
Oh,
contract.
oh, bummer, bummer.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't mean to get into the cancellation form right away when it's still a little sore point for you. Did they try different insurance companies, or that was just the only?
The buyer's agent suggested that to her buyer, but the buyer was unwilling to change agents because she has been with them for so long, and it's through that UAAA or something like that for veterans.
USAA, yeah, I think so.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Have you got any backup interest in it?
Well, we did get another offer a couple days later. It was a pretty lowball offer, but the problem with that offer was it was an FHA, and with FHA, they're going to ask for a septic inspection, and it's not going to pass the septic inspection. So
All right.
the seller declined that offer.
Okay, so what Steve's dealing with is a property out in the country up near Ferndale. And it has an old septic system in it, which I guess the bottom has collapsed out of. So it was a concrete tank or something. So it's certainly not up to code or even functioning properly. So yeah, it's maybe something the seller's going to have to deal with. The seller's willing to give a credit to a buyer to take care of it, but it sounds like without a cash buyer who has an insurance company that will underwrite the property, it may just have to be repaired before it can be sold. Never know. All right. Well, thanks for sharing there, Steve. And good luck with getting a further sale, we hope. Question came up around the RR form, the famous RR form. Let's go take a look at that. So let me get here. The buyer and seller's agents, I think we were representing the seller. This buyer had done their inspections and they were asking for certain things to be done. And the buyer and seller agents talked, and the buyer and seller agreed to it verbally. So what the buyer's agent did then was write it up on an addendum. Well, remember, we use addendums when we're writing up a contract in the initial stages, but once a contract is ratified, we use an amendment. So and so they were going to skip this step of request for repair and go straight to the amendment because they had verbal agreement with everybody for the stuff that was requested or the credit. And frankly, that's okay. The RPA says that a buyer has the right to the RPA says a lot of things, but about this particular notion, it says that the sale is as is. So the sellers are always telling us, yeah, well, I want to sell it as is. And we can point out to them, well, yeah, it's an as is contract. But remember, the buyer has the right to inspect and the buyer has the right to request repairs. And then you, Mr. Seller, can evaluate that. So typically it's done through the request for repairs. That's what the RPA says that the buyer should do, is fill out a request for repairs and submit it to the seller. And then if everyone agrees, fills out the form, buyer signs it, seller agrees to it, signs it, then then typically we would write it up in an amendment form. Because if it's a credit, the lenders going to want to know about it. If it's a cash sale, you probably don't even need that. You could just work off the request for repair, and just proceed on to escrow. But ideally, you do the request for repair, everyone agrees to it, you write it up in an amendment, everybody signs off on it, and now you have an amended contract. The request for repair is not an attachment to the, it's not a contractual binding document in the sense of as an amendment is or an addendum would be. So you could ad lib with it, but you really want to go from the RR, the approved RR, to an amendment. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay.
I do have a question,
Here you
Gary.
go. Mhm.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, we would fill out the RR and then we would fill out an amendment?
Yeah,
And then
so
the amendment would then go to escrow and,
yeah, and
or,
the RR doesn't get submitted to escrow.
okay, all right.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
because sometimes the RR has references to reports like a pest report or something that the lender hasn't seen or didn't require, and it may have some items in it that the seller is willing to give credit for, some section 1 work or something, but the lender, if they see that, is going to want those repairs done prior to closing. So it's just been a practice. We don't, kind of disclose those if the parties can work it out between themselves. And therefore, the amendment might say that the seller to credit buyer blank, blank, blank amount of money through escrow for closing costs, when really it's a credit for, section 1 work or something like that. So that's why we do those two different documents. Yeah, Yvonne?
Yeah, I understand all of that, but you also just said that the R for R isn't really contractual. That's the
Right.
way an amendment is. But generally speaking, what I've done and what I know other agents have done is if you have a cash buyer, you really don't need to do that amendment. So in that case, is the R for R really enough, or should we always be doing an amendment?
I don't believe in that. Let's look at the RR again.
Because it certainly ties to the contract.
Well, let's just see what exactly, if it qualifies as a binding document on both parties.
Okay.
So let me just, so in accordance with the terms of the purchase agreement, probably the seller as referred to the parties, okay, and the buyer requests, okay, so they made a request. And then there's an expiration of the buyer's request, which is an important thing. So if the seller doesn't respond, this goes away. And then the seller response. Seller agreement. And so the seller can agree to the buyer's requests, or they can make a partial agreement to the buyer's requests and additional conditions, blah, blah, blah. Or they can submit an RRR form under 2 here, 3. Seller's response to buyer's RR on the terms above and acknowledges receipt of a copy by making the seller response. Any previous RR or seller response and buyer reply can no longer be accepted. So it looks like, it refers to the property. It has terms in it that both parties are agreeing to. So without being a lawyer, which I'm not, my guess would be that it has a very good chance of being binding. let's just look at the amendment form and see if there's any language in the amendment form that would make us think differently. So the amendment, this is a proposal to amend, so that's like asking for the repairs, the terms and conditions that have already been mutually executed, and the buyers and sellers are referred to the party. And then you just type in here what the amendment is. It has an expiration, it has an acceptance. So it seems it's worded the same way. So I think you're basically in good shape. Using that in a cash transaction where you could just let the you could actually submit that to the escrow company as a document that needs to be accounted for in the escrow. So I think it's only when you need to pass it on to the lender that, the amendment is a better form than the RR.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question. Okay, we had a situation come up where our agent listed a property, and this is a good sign in the marketplace, I guess. They listed the property on Tuesday. An alert buyer's agent in the area, or actually out of the area with a buyer, found the listing later that same day. They arranged to come see the property the next day, and they wrote an offer on it. And it was a good offer. It was an all cash sale, 5-day inspection, over asking price. And a 15-day close. So, I mean, it was a very clean, nice offer. And so our agent presented it to the seller, and the seller says, I like this offer. This is a good offer. And so we haven't had the brokers open. We haven't had the scheduled weekend open, Sunday open that was scheduled. So what is our agent supposed to do then? Anyone?
I would think, if the seller wants to accept the offer, the seller accepts the offer, and the agent could put something in the listing in the private remarks. If, that the seller would still be open to looking at other offers, if that's true.
Right.
Yeah.
That's all good, but we need to go a step further. Our agent needs to do another thing.
I mean, besides changing the status?
Yeah, yep.
Okay.
Probably some
Um,
documentation.
we want the agent to document the conversations they had with the seller, explaining the options that the seller had.
Okay, gotcha.
So they could write an email to the seller and say, this is to confirm that we discussed the offer that was presented on such and such a date, and that we discussed your options as being to accept the offer, to reject the offer and wait for your open house, to reject the offer and wait for the brokers open, to counter the offer. So when we present the offer to the seller, we need to explain to them the options they have in dealing with that offer. And of course, one of them is accepting it. And that's what the seller decided to do. But we want to document that we went over the options. Because what's happened in the past in highly volatile markets where the property values were accelerating, that 3 months later, the seller, the properties are worth more than they were, in some markets we've had, we're appreciating in excess of 15% a year. So, let's say the property went up 5% in 3 months, and the seller comes back and says, well, you know, I sold the property for too little, even though it was over asking price. And you didn't tell me I should wait. You know, so that's why we want to document that. So that's the other thing we're going to want in that situation is documentation. You either write a memo to yourself that I had this discussion with the seller, or you write it to the seller and then you give it to Keely or Chris or your other TC, Katie, whoever you're dealing with, and that goes in the file with everything else. Okay? Okay. So we talked about the difference between counter offer and addendum or an amendment. The reason we want to use that amendment form when we're amending terms in a contract is that if you don't use an amendment form, if you used an addendum at that point or a counteroffer and the seller rejects it, then the seller could cancel the transaction if they wanted to. So the amendment form and the RR form both have provisions in them that they have an expiration date in case the seller doesn't respond and or the other party doesn't respond in the case of an amendment. And therefore it can't, neither party could take the step of canceling because you had a counteroffer that wasn't ratified. I mean, it's like if you were in just in a preliminary offer situation when you got a offer and then the seller can write a counter offer and then the buyer wrote a counter to the counter offer and then the seller said, no, I don't want to accept that. What happens? Deal is dead, right? So if you introduce a counter offer, 6 weeks into the transaction or 3 weeks into the transaction, that's the same thing. Seller doesn't accept it, we're out of here. So that's the reason to use that amendment form. It's very important. And not the addendum and not a counter. Use the amendment form once you're in escrow. Okay. Any questions? Let's skip on to the RPA. We had something come up in the RPA this week. Okay. Those of you not familiar with the RPA, when you pull it up, it does have that training section that goes over each paragraph in the RPA. So that's a good thing for new folks to review when they first open up this form in ZipForms. Okay, so here we are in the RPA, and paragraph 3 is the grid. And paragraph 3E1, well, let's start with the initial deposit. Okay, let's start with 3D1, because we got a question about this week too. So the initial deposit, and agents will sometime ask, well, what should the initial deposit be? Well, because this is if the property is a residential 1 to 4 and it's subject to liquidated damages, the limit for the loss of a deposit in the case of a buyer's default is 3% of the purchase price. So the standard practice is that between D1 and D2, the initial deposit and the increased deposit, those two numbers add up to 3%. So you might say, let's say our purchase price is 750,000. And you're going to put, say, 1% down here, 7,500. So that would mean you'd put in increased deposit, you would put in 15,000, 2%, and you'd get up to your 3% that way. That's a very good scenario in terms of that should be acceptable in most conditions. If buyers have ready cash and they want to make a stronger offer, they could forget about the increased deposit, just go straight to 3% here and start out with a little stronger position because they put all that money in now. But I tend to like kind of round numbers in here. 7,500, 10,000, something that's nice. And we used to call it earnest money. It's just showing good faith that the buyer is not screwing around here. They've actually got some skin in the game. And it's a kind of hold your finger up in the wind to determine what the direction is as to how much you put in there. But I tend to like around 1% for the initial deposit, and then the 2% in the increased deposit for a total of 3% prior to closing. Okay, any questions about that? Okay. If you're dealing with a commercial property or something else like that, then it might be a different scenario. So the other thing that came up this week was in this 3E1, the loan amount. So let's go back to our scenario where we've got our we got 7,500 and we have our 10,000. We've got our 3%, and now we're going to get a loan of 80%.
We're not seeing your screen anymore.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Sharon. Let me back out and start over then. That's right. I went here, didn't I? Oops. Okay. Okay. Thank you. So we've gone back and we've got our 70, and now we're going to have an 80% loan to value here, and about 80% of 7,500 is 600,000. Yeah, and then the balance calculate down here. The balance of down payment due at closing is going to be 127.5. This does the math for you, which is nice. What happened here was our agent filled all this out very nicely, but they didn't check these boxes here in 3E1, the interest rate not to exceed. This is a protection for the buyer, our client, that, we may have we should have a pre-approval letter that the buyer's gotten from their lender. And the pre-approval letter is probably based on an interest rate of some amount. Say it's 7%. Well, and the buyer qualifies for that, but at maybe 7.5%, they no longer qualify for that. So you would want the buyer to have the ability to cancel if they can't get their 7% mortgage. So you talk to the lender, buyer's lender. You ask them, what amount shall I put in here to protect the buyer in case the interest rates go up between now and closing? Because at this point, you haven't locked the loan in yet, right? You just got a pre-approval. So the lender tells you, well, put in 7.5 and 1 point, and you put that in. And these are protections for the buyer. So you should always be filling this section out completely if there's a loan. And so, any questions on that?
Garrett,
Yes.
I'm sorry.
that's
No,
okay. I
Don't be
snuck
sorry.
in.
That's why we're doing this.
Okay, so, go
go ahead.
ahead. Yvonne, you
you-
go ahead.
Okay. Okay, Julie, thanks. As far as the points, the way it's stated, so if the buyer is going to pay points, then you really need to put that in there, because otherwise they can't. Or, I mean, does it really control anything with putting the points in?
The only thing it does is if let's say the points went up beyond this 1%.
Okay,
Um, because it says up to.
got it.
So
So
like, not to exceed 7.5,
Right,
the buyer
right.
will pay up to.
Okay,
So that's a little protection built in for our
Yeah.
buyer, just
so
in
it's,
case.
yeah,
Yeah, the terms change.
okay, good idea then. All right, thanks. Go, Julie.
All right, so mine's in the same vein, and on the next page, it'll say, you know, that the buyer requests X amount credit.
Mhm.
So with a couple of my transactions, I put that in there, and the buyer has basically bought down their with points with that credit to get a lower interest rate.
Mhm.
And so I've reflected that amount. We're not going to exceed, say, 5.5% or 6%, because we're gonna buy the points down, and however many points that is, I insert that. And is that the
Yeah.
way it should be handled?
I think that's appropriate. Yep. If you're, Julie's talking about down below here, and G1, the seller credit to buyer, if any. And you were going to put in $10,000 here. And you could then check here under other and say loan buy. And that your loan buy down is going to get you down to, say, 6.5% based on what your lender's telling you. You still want to put it in there just in case the market changes, but you could put in the number that you're buying it down to. We definitely need the lender's help in figuring all this out, whatever the lender is telling you, and then if it gets screwed up sideways from there, at least we've got the lender on board for having told us to do it, right? But yeah, you would handle it that way, Julie. It sounds fine. Steve, your hand was up and down. You good? Okay. Good there. We had a situation came up this week where we're representing a property that has tenant. And the tenant's been there quite a while. There's no lease. They're just occupying on a month-to-month basis. And the tenant's unhappy that they're, might be asked to move if the property sells, and came up with a novel idea. They said to the owner that there's California, this is what the tenant speaking to the owner, right? They said there's a California law that you can't show this property without giving me 120 days prior notice that of your intent to sell it. And we said, what? So our seller comes to us and says, what? And I said, well, and then the agent calls me and says, what is this? I never heard of that. And I said, well, I've never heard of that either. So we sent a note off to Bill and Shannon, our broker risk management folks, and they wrote back as follows. The tenant is confused or may have been fed misinformation. Well, this is Bill speaking. What I think that the tenant may be referring to is that if a property is being offered for sale, then the landlord may give the tenant a written notice that for the next 120 days, the landlord or their agent only need to give the tenant a 24-hour oral notice to show the property to prospective tenants. See attached form, a CIR form for that purpose. So there is a form here about that. And it's called the NSE. Let's see. Notice of sale and entry. And this says to the tenant and the street address and so forth. You are hereby notified that the housing provider, that i.e. the landlord, is selling the premises pursuant to California Civil Code, bit 1954. For the next 120 days, this housing provider or their agent may now enter the premises during normal business hours with 24 hours oral notice to show the premises to prospective or actual purchasers. Signed by the housing provider. And then there's this delivery of notice and proof of service. You delivered it personally, whatever you did. You left it at the entry, you mailed it, whatever you did. This doesn't even require an acknowledgement from the tenant. I mean, this is just a notice. So our client, the seller, after getting this information, says, well, can I share what your attorney said to you with the tenant? And what's the answer to that? Anyone?
That would be fill out that form and hand it to the tenant.
Well, the question is, can before getting to the form, the question is, can our client, the seller, make a copy of the email that was to us from our attorney and give it to the tenant as a notice?
That would be no.
Thank you, Eric. Good. Yeah, and the reason it's no is our attorney is our attorney. They represent us as agents and us as brokers. They don't represent our clients. So whenever we ask a question of clarity for our purposes, the answer is to us. The client, it's not the same answer to the client. We can tell them what our attorney thinks, but we would always say that owner, Mr. or Mrs. Owner, you need to go get a qualified California real estate attorney. I popularly call that a QURCA. You need to go get a qualified California real estate attorney. And in this case, one who specializes in landlord-tenant law. Okay, you just don't want a QURCA who just does transactions. You want one who's up to date on landlord-tenant law. So we can tell them, well, this is what our attorney told us, but they advise us, they don't advise you. So you need to, we can give you this form, this NSE form that is cites a statute, which is section 1954 of the California law. But we don't know anything more about it. It's like that disclaimer that we aren't investigating that. Like, we aren't going to go read the statute and try to interpret it. That's lawyer work. So before you use the form, we counsel that you discuss this with a qualified California real estate attorney, a QURCA, who has landlord-tenant experience. Okay? Hi, Steve. Yeah.
I was going to say I came across this issue and I was representing a seller and there was a tenant issue, and you gave me, I believe, Tom Davenport's name as a qualified real estate attorney, and my seller got in touch with Tom and was very, very happy and pleased and said that Tom was worth every single penny. So if you don't know of a good real estate attorney, Tom Davenport is a good one. So thanks a lot for giving me that recommendation.
Sure, Stephen. Thanks for, I'll pass that on to Tom. In fact, I have, because you told me that before, but thanks for sharing it with the group. And yeah, sometimes our clients don't know, well, can you recommend a qualified California real estate attorney? And then maybe you've dealt with one in the past and say, well, I have dealt with this person And they've done a good job as far as I know, but you need to interview them yourself and see if they, you're happy with their service. I often get a call and said, well, we recommend an attorney. Can you recommend an attorney? And I have 2 or 3 names that I pass on usually. It's like recommending a vendor for inspections or something. You like to give the several options and not just one. But you can always speak from your own experience. Say, I've dealt with this attorney in the past and they've done a good job for me, but you need to verify that for yourself, to have a conversation with them, make sure they can handle your problem and proceed from there. So Tom does do a good job with that stuff. So bottom line is they don't want us working, getting ourselves into property management positions unless we're doing property management as a regular part of our business. We don't want to stick our toe into commercial real estate unless we're doing commercial real estate as a practice. We want to work with someone who is experienced in that area. We don't want to venture into, say, business opportunity sales unless that's a regular part of our business. We'll find someone who has experience in that, either within our firm or outside our firm, and we'll work with them. We'll share the commission because it's not worth taking on the risk of diving into areas that we don't have expertise. Unless you're an experienced property manager and doing that as a regular part of your business, which we should know about because we are liable for those activities. In fact, I got a call yesterday. We are starting up a new property management division called Better Invested Property Management. And we have a new client who is a property owner with tenants, and they want to employ our group. And they said, I had this agreement with this other property management, and she ran off with all the deposits and the rents from the property and disappeared. And we said, oh, this is not good. And it exceeded like $10,000. And so we can't give that new client of ours any legal advice. We had to refer them to a QURCA, qualified California real estate attorney, specializing in landlord-tenant relationships, about how they can pursue that party. Well, turns out the party worked for a broker. And our agent, being helpful, trying to be helpful for the client, called the broker and said, listen, are you aware that Sally, who has a license with your firm, was doing property management and ran off with the $10,000 worth of rents and deposits? And he said, no, I didn't know Sally was doing property management. She never told me. I'm not responsible. Now, is that going to hold up? No. No, he is responsible. And he keeps saying, no, you have to go find her because I'm not responsible. Well, that's not how the California real estate law works. So I'm just saying, don't do it property management without telling us. And because one of these days, I'm going to get a call and says, hey, did you know Sally was doing property management? I said, I didn't know. And she ran off with $5,000 worth of deposits. I said, well, that's not good. And who's going to have to write the $5,000 check? We are, Randy and me. So anyway, don't dabble in property management unless it's your own property. Steve manages his own property. He does a very good job. But he doesn't represent, he's not representing himself as a real estate agent in that. He's representing himself as a principal. So when we get into these situations with tenants, just that we need to advise the client that if there's a problem, they need to speak to a qualified California real estate attorney. I'm sorry, I'm droning on about this. Okay. 2 more things I wanted to cover this morning. Are there any questions on that? Okay. We got this weekly practice tip this week on disclosure of death on the property. Now, we get these pretty much weekly. Once in a while, they skip a week, but and I send them along unless they're totally inappropriate for, us to consider. Once in a while they are. But most of these are valuable practice tips, which is why I send them along. And if you don't do anything else, skip down to the bottom part here, and they do a summary of practice tips. And these should be part of your practice. Because what happens if we ever get called into court on a transaction, the question is going to come up of standard of practice. What is your standard of practice? And if you recite, well, this is what I told the seller, or this is how I work with every buyer, this is how I work with every seller, then we're following the standard of practice. So the practice tip here is if a death occurred on the property and you are listing, recommend that the seller disclose it. So if the seller refuses to disclose it, saying, well, it happened more than 3 years ago, I know I don't have to disclose it. Contact the manager, your manager, and see who can address the issue with us. It's recommended that the death occurring on the property be disclosed no matter when the death occurred. So the statute says 3 years. Our legal counsel recommends that we always disclose it, whether it's past 3 years or not. If you represent a buyer and the buyer has indicated to you that it is important to them that no one previously passed away on the property, ask the listing agent in writing to confirm with the seller whether there has been a death on the property, irrespective of when it may have occurred. Some folks are very sensitive about moving into a property where there's been a death in the property or on the property. On the seller property questionnaire, it asks the seller to disclose if a death occurred less than 3 years before. It is recommended that listing agents advise their clients to disclose the death irrespective of the time frame. And if the seller refuses to disclose a death, refer the seller to a qualified California real estate attorney to discuss the issue. And bring it up with us if you're getting resistance in that area. Remember,
So Gary,
yeah, go ahead.
in regards to the death on the property,
Mm-hmm.
so would the seller then check the box, no, that there hasn't been a death within 3 years, but then under comments, would they put that under comments there?
Yeah, because I think in the SBQ, I think you're right, it says within the past 3 years, you would check no, but then under additional comments, they would add there was a death on the property 5 years ago or 10 years ago, whatever it is, if the seller is aware of it. Now, if there was a death on the property that the seller was never made aware of, they can't disclose it, right? I think one of the examples in that practice tip is that the neighbor came over and said, are you aware, to the listing agent at the open house, and said, are you aware that, there was a murder on the property, 10 years ago? And he says, well, no. And then what do? We go back to the seller and say, hey, neighbor came over and said, there was a murder on the property. Don't you want to disclose that? And we would encourage you to disclose that. And they said, no, I don't want to disclose that. Then we go down the path of what do we do about it? Okay. How do we? Yeah.
Gary, isn't used to be AIDS, death from AIDS was exempt from that.
True, it still is. Yeah. Yeah. So if the death on the property was from AIDS, then you can't disclose the cause of death. And it's not essential really that you do disclose the cause of death, though you might want to if it was something like a murder, that makes it a little more juicy.
Garrett, regarding the AIDS though, if the agent is asked, then they do have to say.
I'm
pretty sure that's the way it runs.
Yeah, let me see here.
I was just reading that in something. You don't have to offer it, but.
Right. So let's see. Scenario: I'm listing a property and the seller disclosed that a relative died at the property 2 years ago as an AIDS-related disease. How should this be disclosed? The seller needs to disclose that death took place in the property. Do not disclose the cause of death unless specifically asked.
Right.
If you are asked how the deceased passed, you must be truthful.
Right.
Yes, you're correct. Okay. So if those practice tips go around and you have questions on them, just give us a call and we'll get them cleared up. So any questions on that? The last thing, and I covered this in our sales meeting this week in Sonoma, but it seems to be it's a different practice that we're looking at, and it has to do with these lawsuits that are being generated around the country around suing real estate agents and brokers for not disclosing how the commissions get paid. That's the claim in these class action suits, that they aren't fully disclosed about how who's paying what to whom. California is a bit different because our listing form is different than some of the other states where we actually have the seller sign that we're entitled to share half the commission with the selling agent, and it actually is a percentage usually put in there, 50%, and the seller signs off on that. However, to further our disclosure, our transparency around commissions, broker risk management, our risk management attorneys are suggesting the following when you go to speak to a seller about listing their property. And what they're calling is decoupling the the listing agent fee and the buyer agent fee. Decoupling, that means talking about them separately. So when you go in and you're going to discuss, you've gone over all you're going to do to list the property and what price, and you're all in agreement, and they say, okay, what's the fee? You discuss, rather than discuss the gross fee and say, well, typically we charge 5% for this and we share half of that with the seller's, the buyer's agent. Instead of approaching that way, we say, okay, my fee as a listing agent is 3%. Then this is what I do. And you have a value proposition about why you charge 3%. And I'm just using a number here, it could vary from transaction to transaction. So they're always negotiable. Remember that. So you've explained that, and my fee is 3%, and the seller says, okay, I believe it's worth it. I know you do a great job, and I agree to pay that. Then you have a separate discussion with the seller about the marketing strategy of offering or not offering compensation for the buyer's agent. Okay. And I think at that point, we have to learn a new dialogue, because now we're talking about whether we're going to be offering a fee to the buyer's agent in the MLS. And the traditional practice has always been to talk about the gross number and say, we're going to share half of that with the buyer's agent and put that in the MLS that way. What they're suggesting we do now is we settle on the fee to be paid to the listing agent, and then we talk about the marketing strategy of how to pay the buyer's agent, how the buyer's agent will get paid. And we can talk about the traditional model and why it's valuable. The traditional model is valuable to that the buyer's fee should come out of the seller's proceeds, because then the buyer has more money to put down on the property. They don't have to come out of pocket to pay their agent. And they can actually get a loan on that, because it's part of the value of the property, and lenders have always recognized that. So you say, let's set the property, let's figure out what you want to net out of this after the buyer and listing agents fees, and let's put the price there and say, we'll get the most marketing exposure if we list this in the MLS and we offer a fee to the buyer's agent. Now, some of our agents opined in the meeting that, well, if you give the alternative, the seller, the alternative of offering 0 to the buyer's agent, yeah, why wouldn't they say 0? And they might. I'm calling that a half a FISBO. You know, we have FISBOs in our marketplace, and they like to go out and pretend they're gonna, well, save money by not having an agent. You know, we don't have any statistical data, but we kind of believe that generally they're going to get less than they would have if they expose the property fully in the MLS as a, you know, with a listing agent, and they are exposing themselves to a great deal of legal exposure because of the complexity of a real estate transaction and the statutory requirements that are placed upon a seller. So anyway, I've sent this form out in the past. So about how we discuss this with our sellers. We can discuss with their sellers that the buyer's agents can get paid in 3 ways. So the buyer agents can get paid in 3 ways: through the seller's agent's offer of compensation through the MLS. That is, we're sharing a gross commission with the buyer's agent. Through a cooperating broker compensation agreement, where the buyer's agent is going to come to us and say, here, I'll bring this offer in if you agree to this commission. Or the buyer can request to pay the buyer's agent through the contract under G3. And that's that new area in the contract. Let's just go back to that real quick, because we're still getting questions on this section of the RPA. Okay. Oops. G3 is in the grid. Seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement, CAR form SPBB attached. Seller's broker offer, if any, to compensate buyer's broker is unaffected unless otherwise agreed. So if you have a buyer or broker agreement with your buyer, and we're told that CAR at the Monterey CAR meetings about 2 weeks ago, the directors voted unanimously to have the CAR attorneys draft legislation for presentation to the legislature that will require a buyer or broker agreement with each of our buyers. So this notion about how do we discuss the buyer or broker agreement with our buyer will go away, because we say we have to. It's required by law. So that's going to be coming down the pike, and could be 6 months to a year, but you know, that's headed our way. But anyway, so we have a buyer broker agreement. It says the buyer is going to pay us X%. The buyer has authorized us to ask the seller to pay that out of the proceeds of the sale based on the general category, or the general terms, actually the gross price, and the general terms of the offer. So those are the 3 ways the buyer's agent can get paid. And we need to have those discussions. So,
Gary, could you just run by those 2 or 3 things that you were talking about as to when we're talking to our sellers about why offering commission is a good idea?
yeah, sure. In my mind, if the buyer's agent has to be paid, and if the buyer has to pay the buyer's agent directly, then they're going to have to come out of their pocket and pay, say, $20,000 to the buyer's agent, and that gives them $20,000 less cash that they have to put down on the house.
Mm.
So they're going to have to reduce the price, probably, that they're going to offer in order to have that extra money to pay the buyer's agent. So if the seller allows it to come from their proceeds, then the buyer has more money to put down on the property, and the lender will give them more money as a loan, and they can make a better offer to the seller. But generally, the seller is going to net the same amount one way or the other.
Mhm.
But
Okay.
mechanically, it has traditionally worked that the listing agent signs a listing with a gross commission that gets shared with the buyer's agent. There's no requirement it be worked that way, but that's how it's worked best over the years.
Right. Do you think that having the commission laid out in the listing is good marketing for the seller because agents will prefer those where it's stated? Do you think that that's
Right.
a relevant thing or
No,
negligible?
it is to the extent that the buyer broker agreement has a paragraph in it that says only show me properties that where the buyer's agent is being offered a commission through the MLS.
Gotcha.
So if the buyer checks that box, then the buyer's agent is authorized not to show properties that are offering
Right.
no compensation. So
Yeah.
yeah,
So it
that's-
has relevancy.
yeah, it does.
Yeah. One other thing, in one of the emails you had just sent out a day or two ago, you mentioned a BBRA form. And I don't know what that is. I couldn't find it right off.
BB.
I thought you mentioned a BBRB, and then you were also talking about the educational,
Yeah,
the educational thing for,
Yeah, the NAR is offering free that you can get an accredited buyer representative
right,
designation. You know, NAR offers a number of designations. Some of you have some of them, and one is a ABR, accredited buyer representative. And in that class, I've never taken it myself, but I'm sure you're going to cover how to work best with the buyer and use a buyer broker agreement. So
Okay.
it's worth taking along with the CAR course.
mm-hmm, yeah, they both look good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Steve, I know, took the CAR course, and he said it was very, very good.
Excellent, okay, thank you.
I have a question, Gary.
Okay.
So when you meet with your seller and you talk to them about the commission and you let them know that they don't have to pay the buyer's commission, I guess my question is, my advice to them would be, if I was working with a buyer, I don't think, because you're going to put in there 0 as the buyer's percentage. Who wants to work for nothing? I mean, even if you do have a buyer broker agreement with the buyer you're working for, and you can ask for it, et cetera, et cetera. It just seems to me that it wouldn't behoove a lot of agents to go and show that property. The other question would be, if you talk to the seller and you say, you know, I'm worth 3%, and the seller says, well, okay, but I'm only gonna pay the buyer's agent 2.5. So then that would be a variable commission, is that true?
No, the variable rate commission, it's an awkward term. I don't, but it's what the industry has used over the years. In the MLS, a listing agent is obligated to disclose if it's a variable rate commission, and what that means, it's different from this notion. What that means is that when in talking to the seller about listing the property, the seller says, well, if you bring in the buyer, will you take less than the full commission? And let's say you've listed it for 5% and you're going to share 2.5 with the buyer's agent. And the seller says, well, if you bring in the buyer yourself, would you do it for less, say 4%? And after you're checking with your manager, thank you, we'd probably agree to that. So you say yes. Now you can offer it up yourself without checking with your manager, but if you want us to participate, you should get that approved in advance. So that's a variable rate. So in the listing itself, it says the seller agrees to pay 5%, but if I, the listing agent, bring in the buyer, I agree to accept 4%. That's a variable rate commission. Okay.
So I guess then the next question would be, can you, as the seller's agent, make 3% and
Yes.
only offer 2.5 to the buyer's agent?
Yeah, no problem with that at all. Yeah, and very often, you know, some properties require the listing agents to do more work. You know, you know, it's difficult to show, you know, whatever it might be. And they're going to earn more because they have to do more work. So, and that doesn't have to be disclosed. Whatever you're offering in the MLS to the buyer's agent is what the buyer agent, if the buyer brings an offer in, they're agreeing to accept that. Unless they submit a form requesting it be different. This was a interesting question we had in the sales meeting the other day, because we've always been taught that commissions shouldn't be negotiated as part of the purchase agreement. Well, now we're using forms that actually kind of do negotiate the commission as part of the purchase agreement. The SPBB basically is doing that. So I'm going to get clarity from legal on, you know, is that a change in law, or how are we dealing with that? Because the practice has been that we don't negotiate commissions as part of the purchase agreement. Now, if the buyer authorizes us, which they would be doing, if we have a buyer broker agreement to negotiate the commission as part of the purchase agreement, then that might be the authorization we're looking for, that the buyer tells us to do it. So, but yeah, having a differential between the buyer's agent and the listing agent is quite legal, quite ethical, and doesn't have to be disclosed. A variable rate commission does have to be disclosed, because if I have a buyer as a listing agent and the seller's only going to pay 4%, and you have a buyer as a buyer's agent, and in that transaction, this buyer is going to, or the seller's only going to pay 5%, or is going to have to pay 5%, they're going to choose my 4% over your 5%. And that's not fair. You need to know that I'm doing it for 4%. And therefore the seller, that buyer, your buyer is at a bit of a disadvantage in making their offer unless they adjust it. That's why that gets disclosed.
How do you disclose it?
Well,
I
if
mean-
you see in the MLS that box is checked, dual or variable commission,
Got it.
and this is a practice anyway. I mean, when I'm going to write an offer for a buyer, and I call the listing agent, I say, do you have any other offers? And they say, well, no, we don't at this time. Fine, you write your offer. They say, yes, we have 2 other offers. And what's your second question? Did you write one of those offers? Are you writing one of those? Yeah, and so you want to, you know, get all that information out up front. And that's why if you do see the variable rate commission in there, you ask them, are you writing one of the offers? And they say yes, and say, okay, well, what is the variable rate commission? Because that's checked, that box is checked in the MLS, and we need to know. And they have to share that with you. Okay.
And then-
Curtis
Oh.
asked, yeah, let me get to Curtis's question, then we'll go back. Can you tell the seller it's the standard of practice that the seller would pay the buyer's commission? And that's not, no, it's not a standard of practice, and that's why we're getting in trouble, because they're saying we made it a standard of practice that the seller is always going to pay the buyer's commission, and it's always negotiable. We haven't made that clear to the sellers, so they're suing us. You know, I got a postcard the other day at my house, right? Asking if I wanted to join the class action suit against me. And I said, no, I don't want to join that suit. Because I did sell a house like 3 years ago. So I'm in the pool. I could be part of the class action to sue myself. You know, I don't think I want to do that. Yeah, Sharon, did you have another question?
No, it was regarding what you, Curtis's
Okay.
chat.
All right. Well, I think I've run along here. Yeah. So sorry to keep you all. Thanks for hanging in. Any questions before we go for this week? I appreciate Keely and Chris, two of our great TCs, tuning in and keeping up to snuff with this stuff. And they will guide you very well through your transactions. We know that. I do have a conflict next Friday, so won't have contracting next Friday. We'll pick it up the Friday after. Right. Everybody have a good weekend and stay dry.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.